Perfect. So again, thank all of you for coming here this evening. My book, Trauma Sensitive Schools, The Importance of Instilling Grit, Determination, and Resilience, was actually published in January of 2021. Right smack in the middle of the pandemic. So unfortunately, I haven't been able to be in person for a lot of events, but I've been very fortunate to meet lots of folks virtually. And so again, I thank all of you for being here this evening. A lot of times when I start a talk, I start with this video. So some of you may have already seen this if you have been to some of my other professional developments or my presentations at conferences. But I like to start with this video. And it's actually a video for a reading and speech school. But I think it has a lot of impact when we look at this idea of relationship building, the importance of recognizing children, whether they're pre-K, K to 6, or if they're 7 to 12, regardless, if they're in our care, whether it be in a school setting, a counseling session, I think it's important that we see what they see throughout the day. So I am going to share this video. Give me 2 seconds. There we go. All right. And I'm going to pause halfway through and ask if you would respond in the chat regarding how does this video make you feel? What do you think of, and how does it make you feel?
Hey, Mr. Q.
Did you see that? Why would somebody do that?
Please go into the classroom, no talking, quietly.
Hey, Miss Meredith, how you doing?
We need you inside.
How do you think that makes us feel?
I forgot my number.
What's your name?
Jordan.
What's your last name?
Carter.
All right. Go ahead.
School is hard enough.
Come on in, sit down quietly at your desks, and begin writing.
This kind of stuff just makes it harder.
I said quietly, please. Who's talking? Is it you, Sophie? Don't let it be you.
Don't believe me?
Sophie.
Please just watch.
I'm not up here for me, I'm up here for you. Pay attention, okay? Now somebody answer me. Somebody needs to answer me really fast.
Every time we're ignored or yelled at or silenced, a teacher takes away what's possible.
No horseplay, no running, and especially no talking.
Moment by moment.
Miss Garrity, your students' behavior yesterday in the lunchroom, it was terrible. Next time, silent lunch.
Did you hear that? Stay in line and catch a bubble. I'm not playing.
If this is education, we're in trouble.
Bye, Miss McGarrity.
Frederick Douglass said, once you learn to read, you'll be forever free. The way it is now, 2 of the 3 of us will never be able to really read. It doesn't have to be this way.
All right, so I'm pausing. And if you don't mind in the chat, how does that make you feel? Like when you see that video and see those encounters, how does that make you feel? Discouraged, sad, for sure. Frustrated, disappointed, frustrated, disappointed. Ironically, I've shown that video numerous times, disappointed, good. And I'll never forget the one time I was at a conference and I showed this and I said, of course, this is an exaggeration. And they were all K-12 teachers. And they said, it's not. Exasperated, that's another great word. And so I was thinking, wow, you know, that's kind of sad, right? That this is where we are, that we feel that this is actually reality. So I'm going to show you now the second part of that video, and then I'll ask you again, how did it make you feel? All right.
Hey, Jordan, how you doing?
Good.
Good.
Everyone we meet throughout our day can make a difference.
I've been waiting for you to arrive.
All the difference.
Good, how are you? Great. Hi, Jordan. Bye, Jason.
Good morning, Jordan.
How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for asking. How are you?
Good.
Go ahead and put your number in.
Talk with us, not at us.
That's okay. I'll look it up for you. Go ahead, sweetheart.
Okay.
All right. Have a
Teach us what we need to know.
Good morning.
That's how we get smarter.
Well, good morning, Sophie, Janicia, and Jordan.
And when you talk with us and teach us, give us bigger and bigger words.
Now what I'd like you to do, children, is turn around and converse with your neighbor and discuss where the mother might have gone.
Words that we can use to read and understand.
She is prey for eagles, so she hunts at night.
And that will take us places we can never reach without you.
Remember, we're entering the learning zone. Now, how can we show our respect to the children and teachers who are working?
We can walk quietly.
Yes. Okay, kids, so what I'd like you to do is continue writing your narrative, documenting your emotions if you were the baby owl and your mother abandoned you in the nest.
What can you do? Learn all that you can so that you can challenge us to be our best.
You would have stayed and assisted them in whatever they needed.
Share yourself with us and show us how to share ourselves with others. Give us courage. Give us compassion. Help us find our own voices so we can become who we are meant to be.
Why would you want to silence us?
So again, like I said, this is from Roland Center for Language and Literacy. It's in Atlanta. It's a speech school. So it's something completely different, but yet my background is in reading and language arts and special education. And then we're thinking about this idea of trauma. And so it kind of brings it all together. And I love the point that was made. Everyone we meet throughout the day, Jordan says, can make a difference. And so that's really, if I had to sum up my book in one line, that would probably be it. Because really, when we think about folks who have been through trauma, adversity, struggles, it's the relationship building that can really support that person, that individual. I'm going to share my screen and go back to my PowerPoint. And like I said, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I really, okay, perfect. Make sure I'm sharing there. I really want to spend some time just answering any questions you might have or any, burning need for resources that I might be able to help you with. So what I tried to do was I broke down the book by chapter, and I took a quote from almost every chapter. I didn't do every single chapter, but the very first chapter, I really unpack the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, the ACEs. And if you're not familiar with it, I highly recommend you take a look at it. If you are familiar with it, I highly recommend you look at the Philly ACE study. The Philly ACE study really looks at adverse childhood experiences from the original study and builds on adverse childhood experiences. So when we think about adverse childhood experiences, there's quite a few that you can see kind of over in the right-hand corner here. They look at behavior and physical and mental health. Right up in the upper right-hand corner, abuse, neglect, and household dysfunctions. So they're looking at the physical, emotional, sexual abuse, as well as physical and emotional neglect, and then household dysfunctions like incarcerated relatives, divorce, mental illness of a caregiver. And so those are the adverse childhood experiences. And basically the original study that was done by the CDC and Kaiser Permanente sent out this survey to over 11,000 participants of, they were patients in their own studies, Dr. Anda, Dr. Folletti, and they found that the more ACEs they had, the more struggles in adulthood they had. And so these adverse childhood experiences is something that we've been looking at and unpacking, and how can we support adverse childhood experiences, and how can we look at this from a strength-based lens and ensure that they're given the support that they need. So something else I discussed in the book is stress. And what does stress do to us? What does that look like? And so I unpack mild or positive stress. I look at the tolerable or moderate stress, and then the toxic or chronic stress. All of these, there could be a traumatic event, but it's not necessarily linear the way this drawing depicts, but trauma could be one specific event. It could be a culmination of events. I talk about something called complex trauma in my book as well. The one thing I want to identify, though, because many times when I talk about stress, folks will say, oh, but, you're here to tell us we shouldn't have any stress. And I say, no, what I would argue is that we want stress, and we want our children to have stress. We want that mild or positive stress. In fact, that's the stress that helps us to push forward, that helps us to keep going. And so that mild or positive stress is something that maybe we've all felt when we had to take a test or had to talk in front of people, or when we maybe if we were involved in sports or other types of activities like dance or plays, we feel this nervousness, right? And that's that mild or positive stress, that adrenaline that's pumping through our bodies that keeps us going. Where it's not healthy is when we have that adrenaline pumping through us all the time. So I'm not going to talk about the biology of all of that today, which is fascinating to me, and how the brain reacts. But instead, I want us to think about some of the impact, again, that this could have when we think about childhood trauma, the impact it can have on cognition, on physical health, on emotions and relationships, mental health. I'm not going to read all of these to you. You will find a number of these that are in my book, and I got this from Child Trends, but I thought that this was a great depiction for this evening so that you could see some of the impact that it can have on childhood. And so as educators or anyone working with children, we might see any of these exhibited in students or children that we are working with, individuals. And so these are just some resources regarding ACEs. So one of my favorites, if you have real little guys, is that Sesame Street is doing a ton of information regarding trauma and autism and any number of social issues, if you will. So they have a whole area on Sesame Street in the communities that I would highly suggest you take a look at. And then the CDC also has a wealth of information on adverse childhood experiences. If you're looking for something for the older population, a documentary that I would highly suggest is Paper Tigers. It is phenomenal. It really is looking at a school in Washington and what they did. It was an alternative school, but they really taught children, the teenagers, really, they're not children, about adverse childhood experiences, because all of them have gone through this throughout their lifetime. They taught them about it. They infused this within the curriculum. They talked about trauma and how they could overcome these obstacles, and talk to them about what it means to be resilient, because they already were resilient. And so many times that's the other piece that I'll get to later. When we talk about resiliency, we say, oh, we have to teach them how to be resilient. But no, instead, it's informing them that they already are resilient and what resilience exactly means. Another book that I love, and a person that I admire so much, someone who I wish I could meet. Well, I have met her, but I would like to have a long conversation with her, is Nadine Burke Harris. And she wrote this book, The Deepest Well. She also has a phenomenal TED Talk. And so she took the ACE study, and she comes at this from a public health lens. And she is currently actually the Surgeon General of California. And so she is looking at how can we all do better when we're looking at adverse childhood experiences. So what she did was, in her clinic, she had a whole team of folks that would come in, and it wasn't just a pediatrician that would see the child. They had a social worker, they had a psychologist, they had a psychiatrist. They would inform the parents about what adverse childhood experiences are, why some of the behaviors they were seeing in their children were not ADD or ADHD, but they instead were as a result of trauma. So I do have in my book a chapter on domestic violence, because many times we don't realize how prevalent domestic violence truly is in homes. And so if we see children the next day, we don't know what happened the night before. So Laurel House, which is in Montgomery County, it services all of Montgomery County. It's a comprehensive domestic violence agency. And what that means is they do much more than sheltering. They educate. They go into our schools, into our colleges and universities, educate about dating and domestic violence. They also offer counseling, not just for the victims of domestic violence, but also if there's children in the homes. They also offer domestic violence if, for instance, I have a friend who's involved in a domestic violence relationship. And I should have said this to start. I'm not a counselor. I'm an educator. So what can I do to support my friend? How do I support them? So they're there to support those that have loved ones who are involved in domestic violence situations. So they have a great resource there too on myths and facts of domestic violence. So that's something that I highly suggest that if you're in the education field or working with children, you might want to take a look at. And then next, I have the power and control wheels. I met this fabulous woman. Her name is Ellen Pence. I literally flew into Minnesota and flew out like the next day. And I met her in a hospital. She was suffering from cancer and she has since passed. She, along with her team, designed these power and control wheels. And you can see the one power and control wheel there. And then the other one I have, nurturing children, because they have since, from the 80s and the 90s, built off of the power and control wheel, a number of different wheels. The whole idea was that these are the different ways in which an abuser will victimize. And so they will use intimidation, they will use emotional abuse, they will use economic abuse. Sometimes they will use the children. So this is why I feel it's important for us to have an understanding. 1 in 4 women are affected by domestic violence and 1 in 7 men. In our classrooms, it's 1 in 4 children. So you can imagine a class of 20, you could possibly have, about 5 children affected. And so that's why this is important to have knowledge about. So I talk about this in my book as well. So in my book, I also have a chapter on the impact of trauma and the interventions for children's language and memory. And so I designed this graphic here to show expressive and receptive language, right? So expressing, speaking and writing, and receptive is receiving, and that would be listening and reading. And really traumatic situations will lead to both being hampered or struggle. Children will struggle in these areas. So you can imagine in school how much expressive and receptive language could be impacted. And so it's really important that we're supporting language development as we're supporting children who may have been affected by trauma. So how can we support language development? Well, we can offer pictures for students to support their storytelling, the sequence of events to build expressive language skills. We can encourage children to use graphic organizers. And I have you can see the graphic off to the side there, the Great and Powerful Graphic Organizer. That is from Jennifer Gonzalez, and she has Cult of Pedagogy. It's a lot of educators follow it, but she has a lot of great tips on there. So I encourage that for parents, caregivers. They have a lot of great information about learning there. And she talks a lot about, or conveys the message about how important graphic organizers are. And so I was a teacher for a number of years in Potts Grove High School here in Montgomery County, teaching children with special needs or have IEP diagnosis. And so I used graphic organizers. And one time, I'll never forget it, young man, Danny, he was struggling with learning. And so we took his history chapter and used graphic organizers to study. And I'll never forget, he got an 84 on that test. And he was so proud of himself. And he comes back in with the test and he says, can we do that thingy again next time for the next chapter? And I was like, absolutely, Danny, because obviously graphic organizers works for you. So there's all different types. If you were to Google graphic organizers, lots of ideas out there on how you can support your learners, whether they're your own children or you see them in counseling sessions or in your classrooms. And then using the language experience approach, it's called LEA. Basically, that's when children create a story of an event that they maybe all experienced or just experienced on their own. So we would do this in the classroom. We went to the zoo. So let's talk about when we went to the zoo. And that supports language development because you're using their own language to support their learning. So they already know the story, right? It's their story. And so you're just putting the words to the story. I remember I have two children, Michael, who will be 22, and Juliana, who is 19. And Juliana struggled with learning quite a bit. I believe she has probably dyslexia that's not diagnosed, but we, using lots of strategies, were able, and her fabulous teachers, I have to give them credit, we were able to use different strategies to support her language development. And so that's something that you want to consider when you're seeing children that are struggling with language. And so also using self-talk to strengthen the sequential process of critical thinking. We all do this probably. I just did it the other day at the copy machine. I had a bunch of stuff I had to copy and I'm like, all right, wait a minute, let me think. I have to scan this, I have to copy this, and then I want to send this here. So it's, you know, using that self-talk. And it really helps that critical thinking. And so that's a language development skill as well. All right, so I'm just looking at time. All right, just a few more minutes. I'm going to get through a couple of these. Let me, I'm looking at my notes here. I want to make, all right, so I am going to go forward a couple slides. Let me talk about this one, and then I'm going to get to my love of literature and talk a little bit about that. So there's a huge impact of trauma on relationships and self-regulation. So when we look at relationships, you know, children when they're young, they build these attachment styles. And so when you have a secure attachment with a caregiver and a child, you can see over here, they are secure, they're confident, they know their world is safe. The caregiver is supportive, they're consistent, they're caring. But, you know, sometimes there's these other attachment styles. We have insecure avoidant attachment. So this is, you know, sometimes a child could be emotionally distant. The caregiver might have difficulty providing affection and or they're distant. There's also disorganized attachment. So this is when the child has difficulty regulating their emotions. They're confused by their caregiver's reactions. They have little or no safety in these relationships. They seem confused or dazed. So again, when we think about adverse childhood experiences, they're living in a situation where maybe the caregiver, they have an addiction to something, or maybe they are in a domestic violence relationship difficulty, or maybe, you know, they have one parent or caregiver who is not available. Maybe they are incarcerated. So, you know, there's lots of confusion possibly. So there could be a lot of disorganized attachment there. Then we have this insecure, ambivalent, resistant to attachment. The caregiver may be inconsistent, or there may be neglect involved. And so what we might see from the child is that they don't develop these feelings of security. And so their needs are not being met. So when they get to school, they may have difficulty with these types of attachments. And so they haven't had that healthy relationship. And so their caregiver should be that foundation, but they may not be. So when we talk about relationship building, that's why it's important that regardless of who we are in that child's relationship or in that child's life, we are building that solid relationship. We're giving them consistency. We're providing that consistency with the understanding that sometimes we have to switch and we have to talk to them at their level when they're available. All right, I have something in the chat here. Let me just check my chat. Oh, bye, Gabby. I'll talk to you soon. So I want to take a look now. Let's go. I want to talk a little bit about the power of children's literature. As I mentioned, my background's in reading. That I received my master's degree in reading. My doctoral degree is in reading, and so I came upon this whole idea of trauma when I was teaching, and then again when I was teaching high school, and then again at the college level, seeing ways in which students would come to me and share their earlier experiences and form their opinions of the world, but then also share with me their struggles. So I really started looking at, how can we use children's literature? And this whole idea of bibliotherapy was a term that was used years ago, and it kind of got away because of the term therapy, that piece of that word in there. And so as a teacher, we're not therapists. That's something when I provide professional developments, I let them know, I let the audience know that you're not meant to be a therapist. So this whole idea of bibliotherapy, which is why I like saying the healing power of children's literature instead. And so, we're meant as educators to provide a level of support though. And so that this children's literature can certainly do that. So let's take a look here. So in my book, I talk a lot about how you can use bibliotherapy within a classroom, within a counseling session, but also how you can use it in a full class. So some of the books in front of you here, you certainly could not use in a full class or with a bunch of students or children that you may have in your care, but you could talk to them about emotions. Lots of children, regardless if they've been through traumatic situations or not, have difficulty expressing their emotions. That's just something that they struggle with. That's a higher functioning skill. That's something that we see when we talk about moral stages of development. That's a later stage of development, but we can do that through using books. So the one book, When Sophie Gets Angry, Really, Really Angry, it's a great book to use to share emotions. Another book that I love is Have You Filled a Bucket Today by Carol McLeod. I love her. In that book, it's a guide to daily happiness for kids, but it touches on bullying. And the whole idea is you have these buckets that you have, and your bucket is filled to the brim with good things. And when somebody is not being nice to you, they're called a bucket dipper, and they're dipping into your bucket. So again, I shared about my children. My daughter, I'll never forget it. She came home when she was in elementary school, and my husband was talking to me, and he said something I think it wasn't terrible, but his tone was not appropriate. And Juliana recognized it and said, "Daddy, you need to stop being a bucket dipper." And so he just shook his head and said, "Absolutely, Juliana." And she left the room, and he goes, "All right, what the hell's a bucket dipper?" So it's this whole idea of teaching kids emotion. And she was able to read from his emotion and his tone that it wasn't something that she was hoping her dad would not do. So that's a great book. But then there are other books here that you can share with children that may be in situations that maybe they are going through trauma. So Healing Days is a book that you might want to share with a child that's been impacted by trauma. Murphy's Three Homes is a story about foster care and about a dog who has had multiple homes. And so it's the idea of talking about foster care and adoption through the lens of a dog. There's also other great books on dying. I shouldn't say great in dying, but that uses Barney. Barney is a dog, and it's the 10 great things about Barney. There's the other one, The Forever Dog. So sometimes that's impactful for children when they have animals at home. Two Homes is this whole idea of divorce, right? And having two homes. The Invisible String is that whole idea of I'm there even if you can't see me. Terrible Thing Happened with Sherman the raccoon. Never says what the terrible thing is. So it's a great book because he talks about how his stomach feels and how he's just not feeling well and how he's tired. And so it's something that could be used maybe in a domestic violence situation, but it gives that whole idea of, a terrible thing happened and I'm just struggling with that. And so this is where I'm not going to necessarily show this video right now, but the next slide I will show you. There's a great resource. It's called, maybe it's not in here, but it's called the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard University. And again, I touch on this in my book, but it goes over what it doesn't mean, how do we define resilience? And so I'll talk about resilience in the next slide. And so let's go there now. The next slide I have, what's grit, what's resilience, and the whole idea that tolerable stress can build this idea of resilience. And I'll talk a little bit about that in just a moment as well. And this whole idea of growth mindset. So I go over all of these terms in grand detail in my book, but you can see there I explain briefly what grit is, what resilience is. However, I want to say that resilience is one of these things that there is a stigma that if there is somebody who may have this diagnosis of PTSD or a mental health disorder, that they are not resilient. And I would argue, and I do argue, that it's quite the opposite, that they are resilient. So many of our children who are coming into our classrooms in poverty, or if they are from an immigrant, if they are an immigrant or from an immigrant family, or if they are living in a community where there's violence, I would argue that those children, those individuals are already resilient. And instead, we have to talk to them and ask them what other needs they might have, just like anyone else might have. So tolerable stress, and I didn't touch on this in the beginning, but tolerable stress is this level of stress that is ramped up just a bit. So if there's a divorce, that could be a tolerable stress level. And it could be a tolerable stress for a child. Tolerable stress could be someone who might have an illness, a chronic illness. And so they have this tolerable stress level. And so that tolerable stress can build resilience, or again, we can argue they are already resilient. So it's that whole idea of building resilience and looking at positivity. And so that's a really, and in a quick nutshell, what resilience is. And also with resilience, the most important thing is relationships. Just like at the beginning. So I'm circling back to that very beginning about building those relationships, whether it be a coach, whether it be a Girl Scout leader, whether it be a teacher, a counselor, a parent, an aunt, an uncle, whether it be a neighbor. Those relationships are really important. And that is where you can support children who may be going through these adverse childhood experiences. So these are just some ideas of some books, again, that can teach grit, resilience, growth mindset. Again, that growth mindset is this whole idea that, if I come into the situation with a fixed mindset, I'm not going to be able to get through whatever difficulty that might be in my way, right? But a whole idea of growth mindset is, well, instead of saying I can't do this, which is a fixed mindset, I say, I can't do this yet. And that's why there's a book there, I Can't Do That Yet. It's the power of yet. In fact, Sesame Street has a whole video on the power of yet, which is great. And I'm not sure if I have it in this presentation. I don't, but it's a great video. So Google the power of yet Sesame Street and you'll find it. That's a great thing to show, especially young children, when you're trying to teach them about getting through a situation and keep learning and keep at it, being resilient, having that grit. Another great book, and it's a movie, Hidden Figures, is great for the older students to see, these women who were African-American women, Black women, and they were in this workplace at NASA where they weren't seen as much. Because of their color, because they were women, and then how they overcame that. So again, all of these books here are great books for instilling grit, resilience, and growth mindset. And so, and then I have nonfiction books too. So these are for older students. Some of these are adult books, but again, teenagers could certainly. Where the Crawdad Sings. Sing is a great book. Educated is a great memoir. Out of My Mind, and I'm looking behind me because I also have Sharon Draper. She has a new one that just came out that's a sequel to Out of My Mind that's also great. So these are just some books that you could use with young adults and adults as well. And then lastly, we have to take care of ourselves. That seems like an oxymoron these days, right? As we're trying to get through this pandemic. But, you know, we want to ensure that we're taking care of ourselves, so we're not having this vicarious or secondary trauma. And so I talk about lots of ways we can do that, even if it's just taking a walk each day, even if it's just pausing. Right before this, I literally laid down for 10 minutes. 10 minutes. I was like, let me just get into my head and get ready for this presentation, right? So taking care of ourselves, exercising, eating healthy sounds wonderful in theory. I know it can be so difficult for us, but trying to just baby steps each little bit of the way is something that we can certainly do. So if you're interested in ordering my book, and if you haven't yet, you can certainly do that. There's a 30% off. There is a code, RLF, and then it's for a Roman Littlefield, and F30. So you can use that. I actually tried it last night. It does still work. So that's perfect. If you did order the book, and I know we weren't in person, but if you would like a signature, I can certainly sign your book. I have book plates that I bought that you can actually stick in once I sign the book. And so if you send me an email, I can certainly, and give me your address, I will send it to you through mail, and I can send you a bookmark as well. So that's something that I can do for you for supporting me. I really, truly thank you all for doing that. I will stop sharing in just a minute, and I'd like to answer your questions. I did not discuss the book writing process, but I'm happy to do that. Talk to you all about how I did that, which I still can't believe I did. I don't know how I did it. You talk to some of my family members that live with me, and they say that it was not a fun time for them. I would argue that that's not the case, but they would argue that. But I'm happy to answer any questions. I will stop sharing now, and I'll put my email in the chat. So that way, if you weren't able to get it, I'll put my Cabrini email as well as my Yahoo. And so I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Colleen. That was really amazing. Really a lot to think about. And I'm just so glad that, you know, as the librarian in me loved how much you included the books. So
I am a book lover. If you could see behind me, like literally, I am actually in my, what we call my cloffice. It's a closet. It's our extra room that we turned into a closet, which seemed like such a great time, a great idea at the time, because I was getting dressed every day. But I have a ton of books behind me. I am just a book lover. And so that's really, I even infuse books in my high school. I used children's books even then with my high school students. They're just, and in the beginning, they kind of bulked, and then they just literally were like this, full on watching. And so anytime I introduce books, they seem to love it. So, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, please, anybody, if you have any questions, feel free to unmute yourself and just ask away.
Yeah, Carrie, I see your hand.
Thank you, Colleen.
Hi, Carrie.
What a fantastic talk. I am so glad that I was able to come and see you talk about your book. As you know, I am teaching college students rather than elementary or high school students, but I think a lot of what you've talked about is certainly still applicable. And I was really struck by the video, you know, the whole theme of relationships, and the video really highlighting how important it was for this kid that people know his name, right? Mm-hmm. Which is kind of the fundamental basis for a lot of relationships.
Yes.
And as someone who is struggling with 5 sections of students and I can only see this much of their face,
Yes.
to even learn their names. I think my question is not really just about names, it's about bandwidth, right? I'm trying to maintain relationships with 5 classrooms worth of students, plus
Yep.
advisees and colleagues and family and neighbors and friends. And there's only sort of so much of me to go around. And I wonder how you approach that issue of really wanting to create these relationships that I know are so supportive and important for students, but also not feeling like I always have the ability to form strong relationships with all of my students.
That is right. That's the challenge. And it's interesting that you say that, because in my class today, I said, I'm not staring. I'm just trying to remember your face with a mask on, right? And so I think being honest, I have found, I want to get to know you. The best way I can get to know you is to have conversations, whether it be before or after class, whether it be come to my office hours. I am busy during my office hours, usually mostly during advising, of course, but most of the other times, not as much. But just send me an email. The other thing I do, and I have this in my syllabus, I tell them, and I don't know if you do this, although it does, like, you get a lot of emails then if you have a lot of students not in class. I ask them to email me if they're not going to be in class. And I just say, just let me know. I say, just because I care. And I have a statement that I now put in my syllabus that says, like, if you don't respond to me, like to my emails, like after like certain amount of days, I might put your name into the care team. We have a care team on campus because I'm worried about their well-being. And I use it under the guise, which is true. I'm a mom. Like I know what it feels like to care. And so, and not that you have to be a mom to care. I don't want to give that impression, but I tell them that I care, and I just try and hit that home. But it is hard. I get it. I don't have 5 sections. I have 4 sections this semester. So I totally get it. It can be very difficult and overwhelming, and the pandemic doesn't help much. And so it can be hard. It can certainly be hard.
We have a couple of very good questions in the chat.
Yes, let me get to that. So can you talk about trauma-sensitive responses to inappropriate behavior? Excellent. So, and behavior is one of my favorite things to talk about. And I see my good friend Trisha's on too. And she and I always talk about behaviors. And I don't want to equate it to a dog, but I'm telling you, when I got my dog, it kind of really made sense, because everything that a child, or every behavior, there's a reason behind that behavior, right? And so when we see these inappropriate behaviors, what is going on? So instead of taking it personally, which I have said to so many colleagues, I'll never forget the faculty room at lunch, and this kid this and this kid that, and instead, why are they doing this? Like, what's happening? And having a conversation. Now, you can't do that and I talk about this in my book, I talk about the learning brain. You can't talk with someone when they're not in that learning brain, or when they're in that feelings brain area. All that's taking over is their emotions. So you might have to wait for those emotions to come down. So when we look at trauma-sensitive responses to inappropriate behavior, to me, that just means waiting patiently. That means talking to them slowly, talking to them in a voice that's not heightened. My voice, which is a bit squeaky and I talk really fast, I have to learn to bring that down. And so that when I'm talking with them, I am trying to ask them what they're feeling and why they're feeling this way. And usually it comes out then. Now, with real young kids, it may not, because again, they have difficulty giving their emotions and explaining their emotions because they're so young. But trying to figure out where that behavior is coming from. A trauma-sensitive approach is really that relationship building. It's really that caring attitude. That's really not yelling, right? And then if we do yell, explaining I'm really sorry. I'm human too, and I apologize, and teaching them how to do that, how to give that apology is really important. I hope that helped. I'm not sure if it did. Kelly, great point. I think it's also helpful in large classes to give the students time to build relationships with each other. Yes, set up an atmosphere where there's safety in asking and challenging, which will help them feel seen, and even if it's not discussing from you, right? So those connections, and that is one benefit I think that Carrie and I have of being at a small university. We're able to do that, and a lot of our students know each other, sometimes to the point where it's like, okay, guys, I'm up here, you know, let's continue learning, because they do have conversations. So that's a really great point, to have those relationships with each other as well. Oh yeah, Kathy, the only good thing about teaching on Zoom is that names appear below faces. Hey, and I used to back in the day, and I was toying with this idea of having them have those nameplates, because now with the mask, it's hard to know who they are. So if they're comfortable putting their name on a nameplate, that would help me immensely for sure. Diana, hi, Diana asks, is it ever too late to teach learn, grit, determination, resilience? I don't think so. I have college students that come to me that have said, I've learned so much about resilience and what it means to be resilient, right? And so, and you know, a lot of that goes into college students. A lot of them, their brains are not formally developed. Parts of their brain are not formally developed until 21, 22 years old. So that's definitely something I think that can be taught. And Diana, even to this day, Uncle Michael say, where's your growth mindset? You know, he uses my words against me when I'm, as he calls it, Negadelphia. So that happens sometimes. Nicole, I teach high school, and I have students who will not open up about what's happening in their lives, but I can tell something is happening. Yes, they are missing classes and failing. I'm trying to get other yes. So thank you. That's another piece that I didn't talk about that's in my book. It's really important that we have a system, right? So it's not just, you're not on an island by yourself. So building that system up with your colleagues in your school, in your district. Also, I talk in my book about the importance of those community organizations. So I brought up Laurel House. There's so many community organizations out there that will support students and you in a variety of ways. So it's just a matter of finding the organization. So reaching out to those community organizations and finding out what they can provide for services. Sometimes parents will ask you, I had parents, I remember I was a 21-year-old fresh out of college, teaching high school, and the parents are like, well, what do I do? And I'm like, I'm not sure, I professionally said, I will get back to you. I'm sure I can find some resources. And then I went and found them and gave them resources they needed outside the school, right? So calling on those resources, getting, finding those relationships for yourself outside the school in those community resources to support you is important too. So I have a few students on. We were wondering, how can we incorporate the book into our daily lives as college students? Excellent. Well, I know that you're all going to be educators, so I think the book can support you there, but the resiliency piece certainly could help as college students in there. I think the domestic violence chapter, believe it or not, would help as well, because we are all faced sometimes with folks that are, or individuals in our lives who are in situations, and they come to us for support. So that could be another area. And then also in there's a list of literature. Again, there's lots of books, professional development books in there that would also be helpful. How do you get through to teachers who are resistant to trauma-sensitive interventions in the classroom and instead believe disrespect is the problem and discipline is the only? Oh, wow. That's my next book. So Diana, that's great. Yeah, it's tough. And I think how I approach it is, let's talk about what trauma-sensitive schools is. And then I say, how many of you do this? How many of you do this? How many of you? And I go through the list and I'm like, you are being trauma sensitive, right? And so even if they are still resistant with that disrespect and discipline piece, and they're using those terms, then coming at it and making them realize that, you might already be using some of these strategies. And then you can go back to, okay, so now let's look at behavior and maybe get to it that way. But I have found that when they're resistant, Or I've had teachers say, well, this is nothing new. I already use this. You're right. You're probably already using some of these trauma sensitive strategies. Absolutely. So call it that. You are trauma informed. You are using trauma informed approaches in your classroom. So talking to them in that way might help. Any other questions? Oh, here's one. How does compassion fatigue relate to these ideas? Support. Oh, okay. Yeah. So I think, well, I know what I didn't talk about, because I was just talking about my book here, but I did, I worked on another research project with two colleagues. One of them is Dr. Amber Gentili at Cabrini University. Another one, Dr. Kelly Ballard, and she's at another institution. But we actually surveyed two local, I say local to Montgomery County school districts, pretty diverse populations, and surveyed the teachers at the height of COVID. So like back in like May of 2020, I want to say it was, and we surveyed them and they were exhausted then, right? And so we had a number of questions, but in a nutshell, right? And so we did this survey, and we also did a book chapter and that's published. But so this compassion fatigue, and I want to speak to the COVID thing. So the compassion fatigue, what was interesting then is they were struggling too, because one district didn't have the technology resources to support their students. The parents were struggling with the technology. So the teachers were not just teaching, right? Which we all probably, if many of us are teachers here, know that that's what they were faced with. And so compassion fatigue, it's tough, right? It's hard to think about how can we support our staff if we're an administrator, but yet still get done everything we have to get done for compliance and PDE and IEPs and making sure like we're not going to court. And so how do we do that? And I think that you have to be genuine with your administrative staff. Like how can we do this legally, right? How can we do this and give them some time that they need? Professional development is wonderful. I give professional developments. I love doing it. Is there a way to give professional development and give them off some hours in the afternoon for professional development to do, reporting, their IEPs or lesson planning, is there a way to do that, right? And they use it maybe for that and maybe they don't, I don't know, right? And so how is there a way? Is it bringing in breakfast if we're in person, for our staff, or telling them, don't worry about lunch, we're going to do lunch. And I know that some administrators have done this and have done a great job. And I've talked to other school districts where that's not happening, or other schools where that doesn't happen. Right. Is there a way that we can provide N95s just to say, hey, we care about you. Let's give you, just those types of things. Can we ensure that the technology is working in the classroom that they're in, right? Those types of things. Can we do those things so that they can then worry about the students and then worry about taking care of themselves as well? So I don't know if I answered the question. That's a tough one. It's really tough in the world that we're living in today. And I don't have all the answers too. I should have said that at the very beginning. You're welcome, Sheila.
Well, I think that we all got a lot out of this and we learned a lot. I'm not a teacher here at the library, but we deal with patrons that sometimes I feel like these principles would be just as applicable to patrons visiting our library on a daily basis. So
and it's interesting, when I wrote this book, I'm like, trauma sensitive schools, right? So I should have made it maybe more broad, because like I said, there's so many things that having a trauma sensitive community is really what we should be about. And so I know Pottstown is really engaged in committing to that. But how can we all think about doing that within our own community, our own little classrooms, or our own corporation, our own workplace? Absolutely. You're absolutely right.
Well, does anybody have any more questions? We are going to need to stop in 5 minutes or so, but I just want to give one last opportunity if anybody wants to ask anything.
And again, my email is in the chat. So feel free to reach out to me, email me. And if you need anything, I'm here to support.
And like I said, we were recording this. So if I'll share the recording with you, Dr. Lelli, but if anybody else feels like they know somebody who really would get a lot out of this presentation, please feel free to reach out to Dr. Lelli or to me. I think you all have my email because I've forwarded to everybody today an email about the program tonight, my little reminder, but I can definitely do a follow-up with anybody who's interested.
Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you.
And thank you for your patience as we went back and forth between trying to decide whether we would do this live or virtually, but I think it turned out really well. And I think I got a lot out of this. So thank you so much.
Thank you all. Have a good evening.
All right, I think I'm going to end it. I'll end the recording and stay warm, everybody.